Hi students, this is Pito, video recording for you from my snow bunker. I'm going to be showing you how I go about doing the chapter 1 out of the service-oriented design with Ruby and Rails. I have the book here in the PDF. I'm not sure yet whether I'm going to include that in the video because it may be too big. But anyway, starting on chapter 1, page 1. So basically we're going to be building a service. Which is an application running on a web server which responds to HTTP requests. Now we haven't covered that yet. That was going to be today's lecture, Monday, but hopefully I'll be able to correlate the two things together. The characteristic of HTTP requests, the most important ones are that they are requests that go from a client, like a web browser, to a server, like a web server, and that they can be one of a few cases called verbs. The most typical one is the get verb, but there's also the put and the post and a few others. And the second important characteristic of an HTTP request is that it includes a URL. And the URL actually is parsed down to the part after the domain name, the twitter.com part, to reflect the path. And the server's job basically is to look at that path, figure out what is necessary to give back to the browser, generate HTML, and send it back. Okay, so that's a service. In the case of building a service-oriented architecture, there's a second kind of web server, one who's not answering requests to people, but to other pieces of software, in which case it's still get and put and post like before, but instead of returning HTML, which is suitable for display within a web browser, it returns a data format like typically JSON, but there's a few others like XML, but JSON is the typical one. Okay, so first thing is, because we're working here in a Ruby app, we're going to be building up the toolset. And as you know, with Ruby apps, the toolset generally are libraries which are distributed in the form of gems. So I'm going to create a new directory called, I'm just going to look ahead, and it wants to be called user service. Actually, first make it. See, this is not rehearsed. It's all real. Let's see if I regret this later. Okay, and I'm going to go into my text editor, looking at user service, which currently has nothing in it. Okay, so far so good. So the way we load up our tool set is just by doing the gem command, which you got when you installed Ruby. I'm going to install the Sinatra gem, which is the Sinatra library. We're going to install the active record gem, which is the database access library, which comes out of Rails, but it's actually a general purpose thing. It's the ORM, or Object Relational Mapping tool, which allows you to do the connection between an object-oriented application like a Ruby app and a relational database like MySQL. So we install that. We install JSON, which is the format I talked about. Now, because they wrote this book with an older version of Ruby, sometimes you'll find slight differences, and I'll point those out. For example, I believe JSON comes built into Ruby these days. Then we have gem install the strange Typheus library, which basically teaches Ruby how to talk HTTP. And then we install, we install RSpec, which is one of several unit testing libraries. Very simple, allows you to make sure your code works by writing assertions that say expect this to do that. Install that. And now I'm going to create the directory structure like it's indicated here, okay? So basically, let's start with the config subdirectory. So I'm going to make their config, and you see it appears here. And in config, I'm going to create a new file called database.yml. Now, database.yml is going to be the file that tells Active Record where the database files live, because the database files are outside of the Sinatra scope. and also what database system they use. Okay, so I'm going to just copy this text here, and I will explain what it means. Now, I know I just did what I told you not to do, and this is enough typing that I think it's worth copying and pasting, but you can be sure that you'll hit problems when you don't quite follow what's going on. So basically this shows that Sinatra has two modes, or as many modes as you want that you can run the server in, and in this case they're representing the development mode and the test mode, and that those two modes are represented by what database backend they use. In this case we're using SQLite 3, and also the path to the file that contains the database. It's pretty straightforward. I'll save that. And now we're going to create the rake file. Now what is a rake file? Rake file, those of you who have done programming before on other systems might have heard of something called a make file. And rake is basically the Ruby version of make. Rake is make for Ruby. And it includes commands that you'll be using as you build your application. So, so I'm going to, because the rake file is just a Ruby file, I can have a few require statements in there. I don't need the RubyGems one anymore because that's an artifact from the past. But I do need to say require active record and require YAML, which is the markup, stands for yet another markup language. It's just a data format. And then we're going to copy this stuff over, and I will explain to you what it means once I've copied it. Okay, so basically, ooh, interesting. So let me just format it prettily. So basically it says this particular file has two commands in it. It's going to represent two automation tasks, or two tasks that you want to automate. The first one is called just copying this, and then I will talk about it, making the indentation good, and now the second one. Oops. Okay, so basically this has created two commands. Really, we're going to ignore the first one. Every time it says task, that's a command. And it's basically going to create two tasks here. The second one is one we're going to look at. The fact that it says namespace DB says the task starts with DB, and then migrate says that the actual command is going to be called DB migrate. And it calls a series of, as you can see, class methods on the active record. So once I've saved this, I can already do some things, not very interesting, but I can type the rake command line utility and ask it what are, by the -T switch, ask it what the tasks are that it knows how to do. And it tells me I have two tasks I know how to do. I can load the environment by doing a rake environment, and I can run db migrate by doing rake db migrate. So if I try doing rake db migrate now, it's going to fail for a whole bunch of reasons. For example, my database.yml file is not validly formatted. So let me go look at that. Line 5, column 28. Oh, line 5, column 28. Mapping values are not allowed. I think I probably have a, oh yes, I need character turn here. Let's try it now. Okay, and it did something. Okay, so it basically created the empty database, and that's it. Okay, let's go on. Now, so now we're going to start at the very beginning, and we're going to implement the first HTTP noun, or verb I should say, called get. But the way we approach this here, actually I'm going to take a little pause, and I'm back. So the way we approach this is by a technique that we'll hear much more about later, called test-driven development. Test-driven development, in the simplest sense, means that I write the test first before the code exists. I determine that the test fails because the code does not exist. I write the code, and then I determine the test works. So the test comes before the code, which sounds really weird until you see that it's actually not so weird. So let's just follow the instructions. I'm going to, the RSpec tests, because we use RSpec, are in a folder called spec. So I'm going to create that folder. And within that folder, I'm going to create the first test, which is going to be called servicespec.rb. So I'm going to new file here, and I'm going to save it as servicespec.rb. Okay? And like any Rails program, Ruby program, it begins with a bunch of requires. So we have here the first thing that says it's requiring a file called service, which is going to be the main part of the program. It requires the spec, which is actually the RSpec library, and a few other bits and pieces. Okay, going on to the next page. Oh. We'll just copy this and I will read it to you and explain to you what it's doing. Okay. And the rest here. And let's make it pretty, and thereby also try to understand what it's doing. So the first line is basically setting. The set is a method from Sinatra, and it's saying that right now we're going to be running in the test in the mode called the test environment. Okay. And this is a bit of setup here, the first line 7, that just configures the test environment. And the next thing defines a minimalist Sinatra application to allow the test to run. And now it's going to start describing the different tests. So the first thing it says is that before running any of the unit tests, go to the user database and delete all the records, because you want to start over. Now remember, because we're running in the mode test, as you see in line 6, the data in the database, the user records, are all for testing purposes, so this is just deleting the leftovers from the last time you ran the test. Okay? So the first test is going to attempt to do a get on a certain URL, API v1 users :id, and I'll get into that in a second. And it says, before you run that test, please create a user called Paul with an email and so that way, and a password like that, and a bio like that, and sorry, here. So this command here, user create, is a command that comes out of the active record library, which is the object relational mapper connecting my user class to my user database. So the first thing this test does is it simply creates a user, and now it's going to see what happened. It's going to try to see what happens. It should return a user by name. So that's the premise. It issues a get command to that URL. It then checks whether the status of the response that it got from the server, because remember, this code is running as a client, it's talking to the server, whether it was okay. And it's then furthermore picking out certain characteristics out of the result. Last response is a variable that's set up by the get command, and it's grabbing the body, and it's saying, is the name Paul, because that's what I created, and if it is, then the get worked. And we do the similar thing here. We do the get, we make sure that it returns the status okay, we pull out the attributes that were returned, and it checks that in fact the email is that, and if that's true, then the test works. And we continue and make sure that it does not return the password, so we're going to do the same get again. So each time I do this get, I'm on the client and it's calling the server and saying, what are you doing? And it's checking that again we can get user Paul, and this time we're going to try to pull out the key password, but we just assert that it should not have that key. So if it has it, then we have a bug. And, oops, this is badly formatted. Let me just fix that here. Formatting is very important because it helps you tell whether or not your code is correct. And finally, we're going to check whether or not there's a byte that, well, let's see, it's going to again do the get for the same user. It's going to make sure it returns a valid response. It's going to pull out the attributes, and it's going to check that the bio for this person was Rubyist. And so it's just checking that all the properties are being returned. And finally, if we ask for a user that does not exist, this should return a 404, as you're well familiar with that, which is not found. It's the HTTP code, error code, or status code for not found. And I notice that I have an extra end here, which means that I have a formatting problem somewhere, so let's go find it. Describe before do end. Ah, here it is. Here's my problem right here. Okay. There. That should be a legal RSpec test file. So, okay, this is all explaining what I just explained to you. And now we can try running the spec and see what happens. Okay, let's try that. So I'm going to do spec, which is a command. If I do -v, you can make sure that, oops, it's not. If you are using RBEnv, like I recommended to you, then when you add a new command like spec, you have to tell RBEnv that there's no command by doing a rehash. So now, oops, it still doesn't work. Okay, you got a problem here. And install RSpec. RSpec, is that the command? That is the command. So I guess they changed the command from spec to RSpec. Okay, let's make a note of that. So I'm going to say RSpec, and then I'm going to type the command spec. That's the directory, service-spec.rb, and I misspelled it. So let me go back and say RSpec. And of course it gives me errors. Let's see if the errors are actually the error I want to see. It says cannot load such file as the service. Well, I haven't written the program yet, right? So this is just the thing testing, but there's nothing to test. Okay, so now we have to continue and create the schema in the database. And the way this works in Active Record or in Sinatra is you specify the change you want to the database by writing a migration. And the reason it's called a migration is through the life of an application, you often modify the database. And instead of killing it and starting over, thereby wiping out your data, there's a notion of migrating it from one state to the next. Okay, so we're going to go to the migrate directory in DB, and I'm going to create a new directory here. New directory, migrate, and in there I'm going to create a file called 001 createusers.rb. It's a file name. The 001 just helps keep them in order, but it's just a regular Ruby file again. So I'm going to save it, 001/_create users.rb. And I'll copy this code in, and I'm going to give you a tour of it like before. Okay, so this is a classic Active Record migration file. So you see that it's defining a class, create users, which is a subclass of the Active Record the migration class, which is part of the Active Record system. And whenever you do a migration, basically there's a lot of things you can put in here, but generally or often it's a pair of methods how to get the database from where it is now to the next step and how to get it back to the previous step, so migrations become reversible. Okay, so I'm going to seems like it added this for some reason. Oh, I see. Yeah, of course. Like that. So once I format this, it'll be more clear what's going on here. So as you see now that I formatted, the migration has two methods. One that takes the data, that is meant to say take the database from where it is now to the migrated state, so one step into your development plan. And if that turns out to be wrong, then the migration also contains data that lets you revert it back. So basically it's saying create a table called users and give the table these properties of these attributes. They're all strings, and including one that's called a timestamp. Okay? So that's the first step. And this is basically describing the relational table, the relational database part of this problem. Okay? So I'm now going to go to the next step, which is I'm going to now create the object-oriented part of this. So I'm going to go back to my directory of Sinatra apps, of Sinatra code. I'm going to open the folder, and I'm going to create a folder called models. And in there, I'm going to create the user model. Okay, so let me just write it first, and then I'll explain it. Very short file. It's creating a class called user. It's derived from the active record base class, which is built into the library. And what's going to happen is active record is going to go look for a relational database table called user, and it's going to grab from that all the columns it finds, and they are magically going to become part of this object or this class. So all you need to do in this class is add whatever additional functionality over just what comes out of the database. So there's two things that this particular example is doing. It's ensuring that whenever a new user is created, that they have a unique name and/or email. And secondly, it says that if this user is converted to JSON, that is to say the data in the record gets turned into a textual representation in JSON, then it should not do return the password as well. That's all there is there. And now we're finally going to go and write the actual program. Okay, so let's go check that out. So I'm going to go to user service. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it service.rb. Oops, that's not right. Here. And copy some code, and I will, as usual, describe what it does in a second. All right, so like it's a Ruby program. This is going to be the thing, the application which actually produces the Sinatra server. Okay, so the Sinatra server is going to run on a server, and as I said before, its job in life is simply to respond to HTTP requests in a particular way. The particular way being the API of this particular service. Okay, so there's a require. We don't need this anymore because we're in Ruby 2.5. We do have to require active record. We do have to require Sinatra, and we have to require the active record file that describes the model. And then I'm going to pull out some parameters. Basically, this says it's going to see is there a -e switch, yes or no, and if there is, then it's going to pull out that the parameter after the environment. So just take it apart for you. And index is kind of cool. It's saying what is the index of this array. Now remember, argv are the parameters given to the invocation of the app. It's saying what are the parameters. Can you find one that's -e? Yes. Then take whatever comes after that and use that as the environment argument. And then he's going to say, okay, now environment is going to be either the environment argument given when the command was issued, or an environment variable, or development. So this is basically a, kind of unnecessarily complicated a step down of possible places to get the environment. Then the next thing he does is he reads the database.yml file, which we created all the way at the beginning. That's this. and from that he extracts the database which corresponds to the environment name pulled out of there. If you remember, there's development, there's test, so it's going to pull out this information, and it basically tells active record, please connect to it. And now finally it's going to say if somebody does a get such and such and such, then do use the user class which we created, ask it to find by name a user with that name, so the name coming out of the URL, so the URL might be, you know, get, it might be http://myservice.com/API/v1/users/pedo. Pedo gets assigned to the variable :name, and it's going to look for a name, a user called pedo. If it gets something, it's going to convert it to JSON and return that answer. And if it does not find it, it's going to return an error with that explanation. And that's all there's to it. So this really is your initial JSON Sinatra program. It's extremely simple. Okay? And now, if I did my job right, I should be able to run this service. So let me try it. I'm going to type ruby service.rb, that's the file I just made, and I'm going to say please run on port 3000. And we have a problem. It says it cannot find the file active record. Oh, that sounds like something somebody hit. Cannot load such file active record. And the reason might be that in the later version of active record, let me just do a gen list active, and we have active record here. It might be though. I'm going to try active dash record and see whether it works any better. No. So here what we're going to do is we're going to just take this error message, cannot load file active record, and we're going to call up our good old Google, and we stick that error message in there, and oh, look at that, pretty relevant. Let's see, it's not exactly relevant. And they say require active underscore record, okay, because they changed the name, so I was on the right track. Try it now. And now it says it can't find file models/user. So why is it saying it can't find the model.rb? You see the error message here. Let's take a look. Models/user. I called it models. I called it user. I think we should do this, which is a new, also Ruby 2.x feature, which I think will make the path work better. So with that, let's try it again. And now we're running the service, and it looks like it's working. So right now we can see the log output coming out, and now Sinatra is listening on port 3000. So we have a little web server going. Okay. Let us continue with the lesson. So basically, what we're going to do next is I'm going to kill the server up here again. We don't need it right now. The next thing we need to do is we're going to add another feature to the server so we can actually store or post a new user. All right. So let's take a look at how that works. So basically, first we're going to write the test. So the test, I'm going to just copy from here, and I will give the tour as I did before. Over here we described the service, but within that we had a description of the get, and now we're going to put the description of the post. So I paste it in here, and again I'm going to explain what I'm doing. So this is the first line, which is going to be the test description, and I'm going to say it should, so the test description is this line 62, and that says that the test is called post on API v1 users, and the first individual case of that is this. So it's going to first attempt to do a post, an HTTP post on that URL, it's going to send with it the parameters that say basically what the user is going to, what the properties are. Notice that he's creating a hash here, that curly bracket. There's the opening curly bracket. In fact, I'll put it over here. I think it's a little clearer. Okay. And there's the closed curly bracket converting it to JSON, so that becomes actually a string. If you want to experiment with this, you can take this line here, go up to my shell, open another tab, go to pry, and type something that looks similar, A:1, B:2, which is obviously a hash. If I say to JSON, it's going to convert it to text. Except we first have to require JSON. And let me just make it a little bigger. You see here, this is a text string, and it reflects the textual representation of this data structure. So similarly here, we're converting that information about one particular user called Trotter to JSON, and we're sending it off to the server with a post verb, HTTP post verb. And now the test continues. Make sure that we got a valid response. And then here's the fun part. We now proceed and do a get, which requests information from the server. And we, just like we did in the other test, come on, why don't I go, let me just give myself some more white space here. Just like we did in the other test, we do the get, we pull the attributes out, we extract one part of the attribute. The name should be Trotter, the email should be no spam, the attribute should be bio. And really, actually, when we finish building the other part, the server side, this is the test of this particular part of the Sinatra service on the server, you will actually see that a record will have been added to the database. Okay, so let me see now why it is that I seem to have an extra, oh, I know, here it is. That's indented, so this is all part of this test. So if you give a tour of this, it says we're going to tell the server to create a user. We're going to make sure it tells us it's okay, and then we're going to turn on and ask the server for that user and make sure we get that user back. And that proves that the server was able to store a new user. Good. Now we're going to go on the server side, and we're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go to the service.rb, and we're going to create a new part of the server, which is the part of the server which responds to the request we just wrote the test for. Copy it over. Oh, I see the problem. There. Okay. Begin. So basically it says here, it says create a new user in the database by using the user object from active record and telling it to create a record based on what's in that request. And then he's going to check that he got a valid response back. And if he did, then he's going to return back as a response the user that was just created. Otherwise, he's going to return an error. And now we see why. I'm going to explain explain this in a second. So we have the reason there's a begin here is because it's a begin rescue end. So this begin end block now is protected in case an exception is thrown. If anything in here throws an exception, this rescue will capture it and return a 400 error. And we seem to have one too many ends here again, and I'm trying to see why that is. Oh, because that belonged here, that's why. That belonged there. Now we get rid of this one. Okay, so we've done that. And it'd be interesting to try to run that test that we wrote before, so let me just try for the hell of it. Not sure at all what's going to happen. RSpec, here we go. And we got lots of errors. Let's just look at them. Don't be scared. So it's saying it can't load the file spec in file. Probably in this here line 2 of the test file. So if we go to the service spec, this line, maybe this also has been renamed to RSpec. Let's try that. And what do we have now? Okay, this spec interop test, I don't even know what that is. I just copied that. So I'm going to remove it just for fun. Let's see what happens. And it's going to say the same thing about rack test. I'm going to remove that too, just for fun. And try again. And now we're going to uninitialize constant test in spec service 5, test : unit test case. Okay. So I think we should put that rack test back in, but I'm going to just show you how I researched this. I'm going to look for rack. I'm going to remove these, put these things back, and I'm going to look for this first of all, spec interop test. Just going to Google it. Spec interop test. And I'm going to say, read this here and see what it says, if it's anything interesting. So this is the actual code for RSpec, and it's just mentioning that spec interop test. So, oh, maybe this is just RSpec here. Maybe that's the problem. Let's try that. Still have lots of errors, and now the errors are where? Still here, RSpec interop test. So let's give it a more detailed message. I'm going to put this in. Okay. RSpec. Nope. That doesn't help much there. And rack test, same thing. Put rack test first just to see whether, or just remove this temporarily, to see whether the rack testing also is giving a problem. It is. Let me just do gem install rack test to see whether that wants to go. Nope. That seems to have worked. Now we're not sure it's the right one because these things have very similar names. Let's see what we get now. Oh, it's getting better. Okay, so now we have to go back to this RSpec interrupt test and see why that's not working. So we can try saying gem install RSpec interrupt test. Nope. Let's go in here and RSpec test. Hello world. Find interrupt. Let me do a search here that says Sinatra RSpec testing. If I get rid of this, then we have another problem, right? Because okay, getting better. It ran the tests. They all failed, but it ran the tests. And it says no such table because I didn't do a rake db migrate. And that seems to have worked. Now I'm going to run the test again. And they all failed, but let's see why they failed. Undefined method get for RSpec example groups. Let me check this out a little bit further. Okay, I've figured out the problem and also accidentally stopped the tape, but here I am back. So basically what we're dealing with here is the fact that the book is a little older, like it's a year or two old, and so some of the libraries have changed a little bit. But take a look at what I've done here. Basically, I removed that line asking for RSpec interrupt test. I removed the line asking for this test : unit business, and I've changed this around a tiny bit. I've added a line here, include rack test methods, and these 3 lines here. Everything else stayed the same. So for now, you can just treat that as magic. I think that's probably the best thing. And I will make a note of it also as I'm telling you about this video later on. But now when I run it, you see here that it says 6 examples, 0 failures. Okay, so now we have the tests running correctly. So now we're moving on to the next test, which is going to be putting a user. So what we did before was to post a user, which creates a new user. Put updates an existing user. So as before, we're going to first write the test. I'm going to go to the bottom here, and I'm going to, this is actually bottom, and again, I'm going to scroll up. Okay, and I'm going to copy this text over, stick it in here, and reformat it again as before. So we're describing what the test is, right? The general name, and the first step, the first subtest, or the first component test is called making sure that a user gets created, which is the only one. So what do? Well, the first thing we do is we create a user locally, and we give them the name Brian, email no spam, password whatever, bio this. So this whole thing is a parameter to the user create method, which is a method on active record, and basically modifying the user table. And now I'm going to basically say I'm going to update the record for Brian to having a new, the old bio, which was testing freak. No, actually, I'm sorry, I take it back. The current created the record in the database saying that Brian is called an RSpec master, and then I'm going to do a put command to the server, and I'm going to say, no, actually, I'm going to decide that the bio is testing freak, and so I do the put. The second parameter is the JSON version of that little hash. I make sure that I get a valid response, and then I ask the server to return to me, this is the next page of the book, return to me what the server has for Brian, and we get the last response which came from the server, we get its body, we convert it from JSON back to a hash, and we get the attributes, and we say, it should be testing freak. Okay? Again, I have a problem with my indentation, so let me just quickly figure out what's wrong here. User create, oh yeah, here we go. This is all part of this if block. That ends the it block, that ends the describe block, and this ends the whole shebang. Okay? So I'm testing it now, and if I run my tests, it should fail. I should have seven examples and one failure, and particularly the failure is this service put on API should update a user. That corresponds to this. Okay? So this is failing. It doesn't tell me why it's failing, but it's the only place it could be failing is this should block here. We're just saying the bio should be equal to testing freak. Okay, good. So now we've testing it. We know that it's failing, and we're going to now go back to the server itself and implement the code to update an existing user. So the server is described in the service.rb file. Look how small that is. And we're going to now add another line, which is now the line that supports the functionality to update an existing user. So we first say, look for the pattern API user's name. We're going to look up to make sure that there is actually somebody in the database called with that name. And if we find them, then we're in good shape. So we're going to then try to update the attributes of that user based on whatever the properties that came with the request. And the if says that it's going to fail. The update attribute is going to fail if, for some reason, that violates a validation, for example, because we have to have unique names and other validations. But if it works, then we're going to convert the whole user record back to JSON, and that's what's going to be returned. Now, if it doesn't succeed, if the update does not work, then we're going to return error 400. And that's the end of that block. And then finally here we're going to say, okay, but this actually goes with the if. This rescue goes with that begin. All right, back from lunch. I was just cleaning up the indentation here. All right, let's read this together. So we're working on service.rb, which is sort of implementing the functionality of our server. This is the Sinatra app file. It's very short, despite all the other typing we've been doing. And it says, when you receive a put request with that particular syntax URL, then, and by the way, the colon name means that's a wildcard, so you can put whatever comes in there gets bound to param's name here. Then first, look in your database, find by name, for a record that matches that. If we find one, then we try to update the attributes, which is another method of active record. And the parameter to this is a hash. And so if that works, if that update works, then this whole method's return value will be the value of that record converted to JSON. Otherwise, it'll be error 400. If during that processing there's an exception, then it gets rescued here, and that too gets converted. Finally, if the user is not found at all, then that's an error 404, user not found. Okay? Go on. Now we can do deleting a user, which is pretty similar. We're going to go again to our RSpec to write the test for that problem. And we're going to put it here, like before. And I'm going to put a bunch of character returns in so we can see it. I'm going to fix the indentation, which is always helpful. And it says, we're going to describe this test as being called delete on this URL. And the individual subtests, there's only one. It should delete a user, and that should delete a user is just documentation. And basically what we do is first we create the user in the test environment that we're going to want to delete. And then we issue a delete HTTP call to our server, which we check that the response that we got from that is okay, i.e. 200. If that's true, then we go one more step and we ask the server to give us user Francis, and it should be 404 not found, because why? Because we just deleted it. So if that method worked, then this should work. And I should be able to call this. Let's see what kind of craziness happens. Well, I've got an indentation problem again. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, that's wrong. That's extra. Do it again, and what happens this time? It looks like we had one failure, and the failure was the delete did not work. It said that it did not delete a user, so there's something wrong with this particular call. So let's see if I can tell what's wrong. No. Let's see here. Well, I know what's wrong. We haven't implemented delete yet. We haven't taught the server yet how to do a delete. So let's copy this code over. And we're going to add it over here. Oops. Okay. Right here. That's a comment. That's the first part of the statement. Next page. Copy the rest of it. Let's fix the indentation again. For some reason, when I copy from a PDF, it loses all its indentation. So now we're actually, it's kind of interesting. You have symmetrical operations, right? You have the operation to test whether users get deleted, and you have the operation to actually do deletion. So they're tied together. Okay, delete. When we receive that call, we have to find that he exists, first of all, else we can't delete him. If he exists, then we are going to destroy him. And obviously, we're going to return the user we just destroyed. Else, we're going to return 404. We don't know who that user is. So now that we taught the server how to do this, this is indented like that. That's indented like, oops, this guy's crazy here. Boom. Okay, now the test should run. And indeed, we have 8 examples, and they're all successful. None of them are failed. All right, now we're going to go one step further. By the way, if you understand this, or once you understand this, you will have understood almost everything you need to know about Sinatra. So it's a tricky case, and I will go over it again. And I'm putting a lot of comments in here, so you can go back and re-listen to what I said, and maybe as you go through it, it'll become clearer. Now the next thing is we want to verify verify, authenticate a user. Does the user's name and password work? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a test. Okay, get the pattern. This is test-driven development. So we're going to go to service spec, and we're going to go to the end. And we'll paste this in, and let's recite this together. So basically we're going to say, okay, post, which is a general command. It's not a put, and it's not a post in order to update. It actually is. Well, let's just see what it is. I'm going to explain it. So first of all, before any of these tests, we want to, what do we want to do? We want to create a user. Okay, and so that's the setup for the set of tests. And here's the test. The comment on the test is should return the user object on valid credentials. So basically, is this correct? And we're going to do a post that's onto a different URL, user/Josh, which is the user/sessions, and we're going to give it the password. And we're going to hope that it is okay. In other words, that the response is that he can log in. We're going to take out the result we get back, which is the complete record for the user, and we're going to verify again that it's Josh, which is who we expect it to be. Okay? So the crux of it is here, right here, right here we're creating a user called Josh with a password NYC blah blah blah. And then over here, so this is just setup. Over here we're going to ask the server, hey, with this syntax URL, I'm asking whether this password matches, whether this password applies to user Josh, and if it says okay, we're going to just double check that it's Josh. All right? So let's see how that gets implemented in the real world. First, there's more to this test, sorry. In addition, it should fail on invalid credentials. So I'm going to do post again with Josh again, but this time I'm going to give him the wrong password, and I expect the last response to be 400, which is not found. Don't know who this is. Okay, so I've got a problem again with my nesting. Oh yeah, the do here is over here. That's indented. Post, okay. That's the end to the do. There's something wrong here. Let me just see here. Oh, right. This whole thing is wrong. You get good at spotting these indentation problems after a while. Okay, so these two tests both are verifying that the login process works. So now we set up the test. They will fail. Okay, in two places as we expected. These two errors, and now we're going to implement those two cases, and we're going to see that now they succeed. All right, so we're going to go back to service.rb, and we're going to add another method here, another URL pattern to process. So we're going to say verify that the username and password. First thing says this is the pattern you're going to see. And then we're going to go begin because there's going to be an exception block again. And we're going to parse the overall parameters that I got from the HTTP request which came from the client. And we are going to parse it, and then we're going to look up a user by name and password. There's 100 different ways of doing this fine. You'll see some of them. This is just one of them. Okay? And basically we say we're going to pull we're pulling the name out of the URL according to this little pattern matcher here, but we're pulling the password out of the attributes, the body that came with this request. Okay, and then we're going to say, okay, if we found a user, then we're going to simply return the user with a success. If we did not find the user, obviously, then we have a problem. We're going to return error 400, and there, let's see what the next page has. And in addition, if there had been an exception, something threw an exception, then That's an error as well. Okay, so now we've taught the server how to handle a login. And it's basically just a different URL which you do a request on, and it runs this logic. So if I did my job right, then I should be able to go and get, oh, there's still a mistake. Only one of them, which is interesting. Post should return a user object on valid credentials, and it doesn't. Okay, so let's see here. So that's this one here. It's supposed to return a user. So basically there's something wrong with this response. Interesting. This is the first time that I think there's something wrong with the code that we got. So let me just see if I can figure out what it is. So we don't know which of these two error cases are happening. So I'm going to put some put_s in here. I'm going to say put_s didn't find user, and I'm going to found user. Found user, and in this case I'm going to say put_s didn't find user. I'm going to run the test again, and we will see that all this stuff here. Didn't find user. We did not find a user. Oh, there's a more detailed error message here. It says the response should be okay, but it did not find a user. Why did it not find a user, I wonder? Well, we can go a little further and we can say put over here, let's see, this is the user. Didn't find the user, so this failed. So one thing that might be fun to do is to say here, put_s params name, and also put_s attributes password. Okay, I'll run it again. And let's go to the top here, and we see here that so the name is correct. The nyc.rbit rules is correct, and yet it doesn't find it, which implies that it's not in the database. So let's go look back to the spec and see we have before all name is okay, and interesting. So we can do a few things. I'm going to just show you how I would approach this. First, we're going to put the debugging libraries in. Require require bybug, and we're going to start with a breakpoint over right here, binding.pry. We're going to run it, and it should hit a breakpoint. And now we can do user.all to see, there's no user was created. Aha, very interesting. User.create name Josh, comma, password, password, ABC, X equals. Okay, it seems like it created something, so user at all now. And it has one, so query, why is this not doing what I expected? Very interesting. I wonder why. Let me just change this before all, make it before each. That's a mistake, I think. Yeah. Let me just make it just before by itself. User.all. Yes, exit. And it worked. Okay, so let me just delete my binding pry from here. Let me get rid of my put_s's over here. Gone, gone, gone. And make sure my test still runs. And I have 10 examples, 0 failures. Great. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here let me give you some closing remarks. Basically, we did not do the whole chapter, and I will send an email explaining this, and I'm going to write some notes about the small changes I had to make. I'm going to put my code into GitHub, and I will explain. I think we went only up to page, let me just see here, up to page 18, and the chapter goes to page 26. Okay, we only went to page 18, but I think that's a good place to stop. So there were only a few changes, but they were very nitpicky, and so probably it would be difficult for you to have discovered them on your own. I'm going to therefore make a list of them in the notes for the homework, and I will update it with an email as well. Let me just reiterate a few things that were very important that we saw. First of all, so Sinatra is a library of Ruby code which allows you to create web servers. Web servers are computers running as servers who know how to respond to HTTP requests, which are just network packets. HTTP requests have, very importantly, three things. They have a URL or a path, /user/new, that kind of thing. They have a set of parameters, optionally, which are attributes, let's call them attributes, which travel with the packet, and they return information. When the web server is talking to a browser, the information is HTML. When the web server is talking to another program, i.e. operating like a client, then they return JSON, which is just data. What we did was we implemented 5 requests on our server, and we also wrote at the same time RSpec tests to test those requests. We have a total of 10 examples, which is what RSpec calls tests, and they're all running. Okay, that's it. I will upload this stuff and make it available to you, and we'll talk tomorrow, Wednesday, I guess. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.